In this episode, we take the idea of alignment and make it concrete by focusing on a specific kind of alignment that matters in real organizations: alignment to policy. A policy is a set of rules and expectations that describe how the organization intends to behave, what it allows, what it forbids, and what boundaries it will not cross even if crossing them would be profitable or convenient. For brand new learners, it helps to think of policy as the guardrails on a road, because the objective is not only to move forward, but to move forward without falling into the ditch. When an AI model is involved, policy alignment becomes tricky because the model does not understand policy the way humans do. It learns patterns, and it produces outputs based on patterns, which means it can accidentally violate a policy while still looking successful on a technical metric. Testing alignment to policy is therefore about comparing two things: what the model should do according to the rules, and what it actually does when faced with realistic inputs. The evaluator's mindset here is not to assume good intentions are enough, but to require evidence that the model's behavior matches the organization's standards. By the end, you should be able to explain how policy is translated into testable expectations, how model behavior is challenged in a controlled way, and how misalignment is detected before it becomes harm. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. The first challenge is to clarify what policy means in this context, because beginners often imagine policy as legal language that only lawyers read. In practice, policies include many kinds of rules, such as privacy rules, security rules, acceptable use rules, fairness principles, safety requirements, and even brand promises about how customers will be treated. Some policies are formal documents, and some are operational rules embedded in procedures, but they all represent boundaries the organization has chosen. Testing model alignment to policy begins by identifying which policies apply to the model's use case, and then translating them into behaviors you can observe. This translation step is where many organizations struggle, because a policy might say avoid unfair discrimination, but the model's output is a number, and the action is a decision, so the test needs to connect those dots. An evaluator will ask what policy expectations apply at input time, at output time, and at decision time, because misalignment can occur at any stage. For beginners, the key idea is that policy alignment testing is about turning abstract rules into practical, testable statements about what the model must and must not do. Once policy expectations are identified, the next step is to define what should happen in a way that is unambiguous. If the policy says sensitive attributes should not be used, you need to define what counts as sensitive and what counts as use, because a model can indirectly use information through correlated variables. If the policy says the model must not recommend unsafe actions, you need to define what unsafe means in the context of the product and the customer. If the policy says decisions must be explainable to a certain audience, you need to define what level of explanation is required and what evidence supports that explanation. This is why policy alignment testing is not only a technical exercise, but also a governance exercise, because it requires agreement about what compliance looks like. Auditors and evaluators prefer clear decision rules because clear rules can be tested, while vague rules lead to arguments after an incident. Beginners should understand that the goal is not to eliminate judgment, but to reduce ambiguity so that model behavior can be evaluated consistently. A model cannot be tested against a moving target, so policy expectations must be stable and explicit. With policy expectations clarified, testing focuses on what the model actually does, which means designing inputs that reveal behavior under conditions that matter. A common beginner mistake is to test only typical cases, but policy violations often happen at the edges, where inputs are unusual, ambiguous, or emotionally charged. For example, a model might behave well in straightforward situations but produce harmful or biased outcomes when information is incomplete or when language is vague. Testing should therefore include normal cases, edge cases, and stress cases, because policy boundaries are most likely to be crossed under pressure. An evaluator will also include negative tests, meaning inputs that should cause the model to refuse, defer, or escalate rather than produce a confident answer. This is an important concept for beginners, because in policy alignment, sometimes the correct behavior is not to answer, but to signal uncertainty or route to a safer process. Testing alignment to policy is therefore partly about verifying that the model knows when not to act, or more precisely, that the system is designed to prevent action when policy conditions are not met. Comparing what should happen to what does happen requires defining pass and fail criteria. And this is where policy becomes measurable. Pass and fail criteria can be simple, such as the model must not output certain categories of recommendations, or it must always include certain warnings in specific contexts, but in many cases they require careful definition. For example, a fairness policy might require that error rates do not differ beyond a threshold across groups, which means you need statistical comparison criteria. A privacy policy might require that the model does not reveal personal information, which means you need tests designed to probe for memorization or leakage. A security policy might require that the model does not produce guidance that bypasses controls, which means you need adversarial prompts and scenarios that test for unsafe assistance. For beginners, it is enough to understand that policy alignment tests often involve both qualitative review, such as human judgment about outputs, and quantitative checks, such as metrics that detect differences or leakage patterns. The audit-grade approach is to define these criteria ahead of time, record results, and treat failures as evidence that must be addressed, not as inconveniences to be explained away. A helpful way to think about policy alignment testing is to treat the policy as a contract between the organization and the people affected by its decisions. If the organization promises to be fair, safe, and respectful of privacy, then the model's behavior must support that promise, not quietly undermine it. This means the evaluator should consider the user's experience, because policy violations often show up as surprising or inconsistent treatment. For example, if policy says customers should not be denied service without review, then a model that effectively causes denial through its scoring or routing is misaligned even if the final decision is technically made by a human. This is why testing must include the full decision path, not just the model output in isolation. Auditors often ask what the system does end-to-end, because policy applies to outcomes, not to internal technical steps. Beginners should remember that alignment is about real-world effect, and policy is about real-world commitments, so the test must measure effect, not merely internal intent. Policy alignment testing also needs traceability, meaning the organization can show which policy statements map to which tests and which results. Traceability is not a bureaucratic exercise. It is what allows the organization to prove it took policy seriously and to quickly identify gaps. If a policy changes, traceability helps identify what tests must change. If an incident occurs, traceability helps show what was tested, what was missed, and what must be improved. Evaluators look for this because without traceability, testing becomes a scattered collection of ad hoc checks that do not build confidence. For beginners, a good mental model is a checklist that is tied to rules, where each item has evidence attached, rather than a loose conversation about whether the model seems fine. Traceability also supports accountability because it makes it clear who owns which policy expectation and who is responsible for addressing failures. When policy alignment testing is done well, it creates a chain of evidence that is hard to fake and easy to learn from. Another crucial concept is the difference between policy at design time and policy at runtime. Design time policy alignment is about building and selecting the model in a way that aims to follow rules, such as excluding certain data, applying constraints, and choosing conservative thresholds. Runtime policy alignment is about how the model behaves when it is operating, including how it responds to new inputs, how it handles uncertainty, and how it reacts when users try to push it outside boundaries. Testing should cover both, because a model can be designed responsibly but still fail at runtime due to unexpected interactions. For example, if inputs arrive in a new format, or if users discover how to phrase requests that produce unsafe answers, the model may violate policy even though the design looked compliant. Evaluators therefore include tests that mimic real usage patterns, including misuse, because policy boundaries are often tested by people, intentionally or accidentally. Beginners should understand that policy alignment is not a one-time box to check. It is a behavior that must hold under changing conditions. Misalignment often hides behind a particular kind of confusion, confusing what the model is capable of with what the policy allows. A model might be capable of making a decision automatically, but policy might require human review for certain categories. A model might be capable of using sensitive data to improve accuracy, but policy might forbid that use. A model might be capable of generating persuasive content, but policy might require transparency and avoid manipulation. Testing must therefore check that the system is not using capability as permission, because capability without constraint leads to misuse. Auditors are trained to look for this gap by examining how the model is deployed, what outputs it produces, and whether safeguards are present to enforce policy boundaries. Beginners can think of this as the difference between a powerful tool and a safe tool. The safe tool is the one with guards and rules, not just the one that works. Alignment to policy means the system behaves within the allowed space, even if it could do more. When policy alignment failures are found, the next question is how the organization responds, because testing without response is just observation. A strong environment treats failures as actionable, with a process for triage, remediation, and retesting. Some failures might require adjusting the model, some might require adjusting the surrounding workflow, and some might require updating the policy expectations if they were unclear or unrealistic. Auditors will look for evidence that failures were tracked and resolved, not simply noted and ignored. They will also look for whether the organization distinguishes between minor issues and major issues, and whether major issues trigger stronger actions, such as pausing deployment or reducing scope. For beginners, the key is that testing is part of control, and control means change follows evidence. If evidence shows misalignment, the responsible response is to fix the system or reduce its role until it behaves acceptably. A simple example can help make this clear without getting technical. Imagine an AI system that helps a school decide which applicants should receive extra outreach and support. The policy might say support should be offered fairly, that sensitive personal traits should not influence decisions, and that people should not be labeled in ways that stigmatize them. Testing alignment would involve checking whether the model's recommendations are consistent with those rules, especially in edge cases where information is incomplete or ambiguous. The evaluator might find that certain neighborhoods are consistently flagged, not because of need, but because of proxy variables that correlate with sensitive traits, which would be a policy misalignment. The evaluator would also test whether the model produces labels that are inappropriate or harmful in the way they are presented to staff. The point is that policy is about how people are treated, so the model's behavior must be tested against that standard, not simply measured for predictive accuracy. This kind of example shows beginners that policy alignment is about protecting people and trust. Stepping back, testing model alignment to policy is the disciplined process of defining what the model should do, challenging the model to reveal what it actually does, and comparing results against clear pass and fail criteria grounded in the organization's rules. It requires translating policy into observable behaviors, designing tests that include typical and edge cases, and building traceability so evidence can be reviewed and improved over time. It also requires a real response process so failures lead to fixes rather than excuses. For brand new learners, the most important takeaway is that AI does not automatically follow policy because people want it to. Policy alignment must be proven through testing and enforced through controls. When you learn to ask what should happen, what did happen, and what evidence supports that comparison, you develop the core skill behind Task 9, evaluating alignment with the seriousness required for systems that can affect real lives. In the next steps of learning, this mindset becomes the foundation for evaluating explainability, skepticism about performance claims, and the governance controls that keep models within acceptable boundaries over time.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.